Alright, so today we're going to continue our discussion on neural tissue, specifically looking at the spinal cord and spinal nerves. We talked last time about neurons being the primary cell of the nervous system. The spinal cord and spinal nerves are going to look at different organizations of those cells, and specifically either the cell bodies of the neurons, the axons, or the dendrites, and just how they're put together on a macroscopic level so that we can actually see them, as opposed to just having to have a microscope. Alright, so the first one we'll look at here is the spinal cord. We see that the spinal cord itself, about 18 inches long, and it's going to run all the way down to L1 or L2 of the lumbar spine. Now, that's the actual cord itself, and we'll look at this in a little bit. But overall, you still have nerves coming out all throughout the intervertebral spaces. It's just simply the cord ends around that level. Looking at the cord in a cross-section view, as we see right here, it's going to have white matter and it's going to have gray matter. We talked about this last time. Which one of these, either the gray matter or the white matter, will contain the cell bodies? I'll give you a second to answer. Okay, from what I heard, that sounded like the right answer, which was the gray matter. We know that inside of the cell bodies, there's what's called the Nissl bodies, which give that gray appearance. So that means the white matter is going to primarily be made up of which part from the neuron? I think I heard it. Yep, that's right, the axons. So the axons are going to be running inside of the white matter. And since this is the central nervous system, there's a name given for collections, or when you wrap a whole bunch of neurons together, specifically the axons of neurons. And if we remember that, that's going to be called a tract. Now, outside of the cord, that's when we start seeing the peripheral nervous system. And we'll talk about that in a little while. All right, but otherwise, if we look at the cord, we see that there's going to be what's called the median sulcus, okay, and the anterior median fissure. All right, so now if we look at the spinal cord from the attachment point from the brainstem all the way down, okay, we see that there's going to be portions of the spinal cord that are going to be enlarged. Now, if we think about why that is, we just have to go back to what's happening at these parts and what needs to be happening with the cells to accommodate that. If we see the area here coming out from the bottom of the cervical spine, we know that there's going to be a lot of organs that start right in this area. For instance, we have you're going to have things like the heart and the lungs, as well as this is also going to be your branching point down to your upper extremities, as we see down here. So the cervical enlargement is going to be related to an increased amount of cell bodies present. Down at the bottom, okay, right before we have the cord ending, we're going to have something called the lumbar enlargement. And in here, there's going to be a lot of nerves that need to branch out from this point, because we said that the cord ends about that L1, L2 area. So just right above that is where we have the lumbar enlargement. So the enlargements, okay, the purpose of them is they're going to have much more gray matter, okay, and the gray matter, again, as we mentioned, has to do with those cell bodies. All right, now this is something that we have talked about a little bit so far, the end of the cord. So the end of the cord eventually just comes down to a point, and the point is going to be called the conus medullaris. And right again, that's right around the L1, L2 point of the vertebrae. Conus you can think of because it looks like a cone. All right, and then after that, and right after that, so it basically goes the lumbar enlargement, the conus medullaris, and then from the conus medullaris spills out all these fibers that run down, all these nerve roots, and which is what's going to be called the cauda equina, or the horse's tail. It's given that name because of the way that it looks like a ponytail spilling out of the conus medullaris. So if you ever saw a question that would say something along the lines of, you know, would someone have a cord injury if they had a a L4, L5 disc herniation, it's kind of a trick question, because no, there's not a cord there anymore. There's going to be exiting nerve roots, but there's not, the cord ends up ends more superior to that location. All right, so now that we've mentioned these different parts of the cord, okay, we see that there are 31 different cord segments. Each of these cord segments is going to contain those cell bodies, okay, and they're also going to be named after the region of the spine that they're found in. Cervical nerves are going to be found in the area, or rather, they're going to be named for the vertebrae that they're superior to, or in other ways, saying it is the vertebrae that's below them, the inferior vertebrae, gives them their name. So to check this, what do we think C1? Where would C1 be found? Between which two bones? Okay, now, that one was a little harder to hear, but from what I think I heard was it's going to be between the C1 vertebrae, otherwise known as your atlas, and it's going to be, and the superior bone is going to be your occiput, okay, or your occipital bone. So the occipital bone and C1 are going to be the boundaries for the C1 cervical nerve. Okay, the one exception to the cervical rule is when we get down to C8. There's actually 8 cervical nerves. So C8 is going to be superior to T1 and inferior to C7. Okay, after that, if we went below the T1 vertebrae, so in between T1 and T2, we're going to get the T1 spinal nerve, and that's where we have this name for the superior vertebrae. So all the other nerves. So if I were to come down, for instance, to and ask about the L1 spinal nerve, what would be the vertebrae that would surround the L1 spinal nerve? Hopefully people said the L1, L2 vertebrae. So those are the two vertebrae that would surround the L1 spinal nerve. Okay, so next piece we'll look at here is going to be what's called the spinal nerve roots. So the nerve root it will be made up of these sections here. We have both what's called the ventral nerve root and the dorsal nerve root. So if we think back to dorsal and ventral in terms of our terminology, we should remember that ventral means the front. So think of ventilation, you're breathing from the front, and dorsal means towards the back, like a dorsal fin of a dolphin. All right, so the ventral root is going to contain all the axons of the motor neurons. Where would the motor neurons' cell bodies be found? All right, I'm going to guess I heard the answer there. It's going to be found in the gray matter of the segment that's associated with that exiting point. Coming back here, the dorsal nerve root is going to be the sensory neurons. So sensory neurons, their cell bodies are going to be found in this piece right here called the dorsal root ganglion, sometimes called the dorsal nerve root ganglion. So I'm going to give you another way that you can remember this, that dorsal is going to be sensory and ventral is going to be the motor, okay, by thinking, okay, that if you had the dorsal, okay, and then, for instance, someone ended up coming and like getting you in the back, you would feel that in the back. So sensory is going to come from the back. And then maybe if we want to go with this, if you want to fight back, then the anterior or the ventral aspect is going to be the motor associated side of the nervous system. Okay, next thing we'll take a look at here is going to be what happens once these nerve roots run through their course and then they dump out into the spinal nerve. Beyond this point, this is all peripheral nervous system. So again, we have a nerve. So the nerve itself is going to be made up of those fibers, of those axons. Okay, and because we have both the portions here, the axons running from the motor, and we also have ones running back here as sensory, we call spinal nerves mixed nerves, meaning that they have both sensory and motor, or in other words for it, they have efferent, meaning motor, and afferent, meaning sensory fibers inside of them. Alright, the next piece that we're going to be looking at is going to be the meningeal layers of the spinal cord. And we'll continue with this in our next video.